Imagine a world where a single airplane flight can change the course of hundreds of lives, where a war veteran faces his greatest challenge not on the battlefield, but in a first-class seat, and where the most ingrained prejudice turns into the most unlikely alliance. Watch to the end. Hello, welcome, enjoy the content, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any stories. John F. Kennedy International Airport was buzzing with activity that fall morning. Among the crowd of hurried travelers, Anthony Carter stood out, not only for his athletic build, but for the determination in his gaze. Wearing a well-worn polo shirt and khaki pants, he carried a worn military rucksack, a silent reminder of his past as a sergeant in the U.S. Army. Anthony took a deep breath, feeling a mixture of anxiety and hope pulsing in his chest. Los Angeles represented a new beginning, a chance to leave behind the shadows of war and build a different life. He clutched the ticket in his hand, an almost unconscious gesture of reassurance. First class, a luxury he never imagined he would experience. Passengers on Flight 1742 to Los Angeles, please proceed to the boarding gate, announced a metallic voice over the airport PA system. Anthony joined the queue, discreetly observing the other first-class passengers. Executives with laptops, celebrities hiding behind sunglasses, wealthy families, a world so far removed from what he knew. Still, he stood tall and proud. His uniform may have been left behind, but the dignity he carried was indelible. Meanwhile, Victoria Reynolds was already comfortably settled in her seat in first class. With her impeccably groomed blonde hair and a designer suit, she emanated an aura of privilege and sophistication. Her blue eyes roamed the cabin with an air of boredom, until something, or someone, caught her eye. Victoria watched Anthony approach, her face contorting into a barely concealed expression of displeasure. She leaned over to the passenger next to her, an elderly woman who looked equally perturbed. "Do you believe that?" Victoria whispered, her voice laced with disdain. "They're letting anyone into first class these days." Anthony, oblivious to the spiteful comments, continued down the aisle, looking for his seat. When he finally found it, right next to Victoria's, he smiled politely at her, only to be met with an icy stare. "Excuse me," Anthony said softly, trying to squeeze past to get to his seat. Victoria didn't move. Instead, she raised her voice, drawing the attention of a flight attendant. "And I'm sorry, Ma'am, but I think there's been some mistake. This gentleman seems to be lost." The steward, a young man called Brian, approached with a puzzled expression. "Is there a problem, ma'am?" "Yes," Victoria replied, her voice laced with venom. "I don't believe this man belongs in first class. Surely there must be some mistake." Anthony felt the blood rise to his cheeks, a mixture of shame and indignation growing in his chest. He took a deep breath, remembering his father's teachings about maintaining composure in the face of ignorance. With a calm that surprised even himself, he held out his note to Brian. "Here's my ticket, sir. Seat 3A. Brian examined the ticket and nodded, turning to Victoria with a firm expression. "Ma'am, Mr. Carter is in the correct seat. Please allow him to pass." Victoria snorted, reluctantly moving to give way. Anthony settled into his seat, feeling the gazes of the other passengers on him. Some seemed sympathetic, others curious, and some, like Victoria, clearly disapproving. The atmosphere in the cabin became tense, with whispers and furtive glances being exchanged. Anthony remained calm, focusing on the view out the window, watching the final preparations for takeoff. As the plane taxied down the runway, Anthony couldn't help thinking about how this trip, which was supposed to be the start of something new and promising, had already begun in such an unpleasant way. He closed his eyes, remembering his captain's words. "Carter, you've faced bombs and bullets. Don't let looks and words get you down." The roar of the engines increased and the plane began to pick up speed. Anthony felt that familiar rising sensation in his stomach as the wheels left the ground. As the New York skyline dimmed out of the window, he made a silent promise to himself. No matter what happened on this flight, he would keep his dignity intact. After all, he hadn't survived the war to let himself be brought down by petty prejudices. Little did Anthony know that this flight would be much more than a simple coast-to-coast journey. It would be a journey that would test not only his patience and dignity, but also his character and leadership in ways he could never have imagined. The plane reached its cruising altitude, and the seatbelt light went out with a soft ding. The passengers began to move, some stretching their legs, others opening laptops or picking up books. In first class, however, the atmosphere remained charged with tension. Anthony Carter kept his eyes fixed on the screen in front of him, pretending to be interested in the flight map, but his mind was far away. He could feel Victoria Reynolds' gaze piercing him from time to time, as if her mere presence were a personal affront. Across the aisle, a middle-aged man in a well-cut suit watched the scene with growing discomfort. Michael Donovan, CEO of a technology company in San Francisco, couldn't ignore the injustice he had witnessed during boarding. "Excuse me." Michael leaned towards Anthony, his voice low but firm. "I couldn't help but notice what happened earlier. I'd like to apologize for that lady's behavior. It doesn't reflect the opinion of all of us." Anthony turned, surprised by the unexpected approach. He offered a gentle smile. "I appreciate your kindness, sir. Don't worry, I've been in worse situations." Victoria, who was paying attention to the conversation, couldn't contain her indignation. "Oh, please, there's no need to apologize. I was only looking after the safety and comfort of all the passengers." Michael turned to Victoria, his eyes shining with a mixture of disappointment and irritation. "Madam, with all due respect, the only discomfort here is being caused by your inappropriate behavior." The tension in the cabin visibly increased. Other passengers began to pay attention to the discussion, some silently agreeing with Michael, others looking uncomfortable with the confrontation. A young mother sitting a few rows back, Lauren Anderson, watched the scene with a mixture of sadness and determination. Her 5-year-old son, Ethan, was sleeping peacefully beside her. Lauren couldn't help but think of her father, a Vietnam War veteran, and the stories he used to tell about prejudice and courage. "Mom," Ethan mumbled, waking up and rubbing his sleepy eyes. "What's going on?" Lauren stroked her son's hair, her mind working quickly. She knew this was a time to teach, to show Ethan what it meant to stand up for what was right. "Honey," she began softly. "Sometimes people forget to be kind to each other, but it's our job to remind them." With a deep breath, Lauren stood up. She walked down the corridor to where Anthony was sitting, aware of the stares that followed her. "Sir," she said, her voice trembling slightly but gaining strength with each word, "I wanted you to know that my father was a veteran, just like you. He taught me that true strength lies in how we treat others, especially those who are different from us." Anthony looked at Lauren, a wave of emotion passing across his face. "Thank you, ma'am. Your father seems to have been a wise man." Victoria, feeling cornered, tried to regain control of the situation. "This is ridiculous. Don't you understand that I'm just—" But her words were interrupted by a sudden jolt from the plane. The oxygen masks fell from the overhead compartments, and a murmur of panic began to spread among the passengers. The pilot's voice came over the loudspeakers, tense but controlled. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are facing some unexpected turbulence. Please remain in your seats and fasten your seatbelts." The panic began to intensify. Children cried. Adults clung to the arms of their seats. Victoria, who moments before had exuded confidence and superiority, now looked small and frightened. Anthony, on the other hand, remained calm. Years of military training had prepared him for crisis situations. He looked around, quickly assessing the situation. "Everyone, please remain calm," he said, his firm, reassuring voice rising above the noise. "Take a deep breath. This will pass." Surprisingly, people began to listen to him. His calm presence seemed to soothe even the most agitated. Lauren held Ethan's hand tighter, grateful for Anthony's leadership in that moment of fear. Michael watched with admiration as the man who minutes before had been the target of prejudice now became a beacon of hope for all the passengers. As the plane continued to shake, Anthony began to guide people on how to stay safe, his voice firm and his instructions clear. He made eye contact with each passenger, including Victoria, offering words of comfort and encouragement. The turbulence seemed endless, but little by little, the plane began to stabilize. When it finally ceased, a stunned silence fell over the cabin, broken only by occasional sobs and sighs of relief. Anthony looked around, making sure everyone was okay. His eyes met Victoria's, who stared at him with an expression that mixed shame and reluctant admiration. At that moment, the differences that had seemed so important at the start of the trip suddenly seemed insignificant. Skin color, social status, all dissolved in the face of shared humanity in a moment of crisis. The rest of the flight would be different. The seeds of change had been sown, not just in Victoria, but in all the passengers. And Anthony, without knowing it, had become the catalyst for this transformation. The plane had stabilized, but the atmosphere inside the cabin remained charged with emotion. The passengers, still shaken by the recent turbulence, were slowly starting to pull themselves together. Anthony Carter, who had become the center of attention during the crisis, was now calmly observing the situation around him. A flight attendant, Olivia Martinez, approached Anthony with a grateful smile. "Sir, on behalf of the crew, I would like to thank you for your help during the turbulence. Your calmness was key to keeping everyone safe." Anthony nodded modestly. "I just did what anyone would do, miss. I'm glad I could help." Olivia hesitated for a moment before continuing. "If it's not too much trouble, some passengers have expressed an interest in hearing more about your experiences. Perhaps you could share something with us?" Anthony pondered for a moment. He wasn't one to talk much about his past, but something about that moment, perhaps the shared vulnerability they had all experienced, made him consider the idea. "Of course," he finally replied, "if people are really interested." Olivia smiled and made a discreet announcement. Soon, a small group of passengers had gathered around Anthony's seat, including Michael Donovan, Lauren Anderson with her son Ethan, and, surprisingly, Victoria Reynolds, who stood a little apart but was visibly attentive. Anthony began to speak, his voice soft but charged with emotion. "I grew up in a tough neighborhood in Detroit. My father worked in a car factory. My mother was a nurse. They taught me about dignity and hard work." He paused, his eyes straying into distant memories. "When I joined the Army, it was to serve my country, but also to find a greater purpose. What I found was a diverse family, united by a common goal." Anthony then shared stories of camaraderie and sacrifice, of friends lost and lessons learned. He talked about a platoon mate, a young man from Texas who saved his life in an ambush in Afghanistan, and a military medic from New York who risked everything to rescue wounded civilians. "What I've learned," he continued, his voice gaining strength, "is that skin color, origin, social status, none of that matters when you're on the battlefield. What matters is the character of the person next to you." Ethan, fascinated by the stories, raised his hand shyly. "Sir, weren't you afraid?" Anthony smiled gently at the boy. "Of course I was, Ethan. Fear is natural, but I've learned that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting in spite of it." Victoria, who had remained silent until then, took a step forward. Her posture was different now, less arrogant and more hesitant. How do you deal with the prejudice you face, even after serving your country?" The question took everyone by surprise, especially Anthony. He looked directly at Victoria, without anger or resentment, just with raw honesty. "It's hard," he admitted. "It hurts to be judged by appearance, not by the content of my character. But I remember my sergeant's words. Carter, you carry the flag not just on your uniform, but in your heart. Show the world what that means." Lauren, with tears in her eyes, spoke. My father used to say something similar. He always insisted that the real battle for equality happens every day, in every interaction. Michael Donovan nodded thoughtfully. It's a lesson that all of us, especially those in positions of privilege, need to constantly remember. The conversation continued, with other passengers sharing their own experiences and reflections. What had begun as a simple narrative from Anthony turned into a profound dialogue about prejudice, courage, and humanity. Victoria, who initially seemed out of place, gradually became more involved in the conversation. Her expression alternated between embarrassment and growing understanding. I'd like to apologize, she finally said, her voice trembling. My behavior at the beginning of this flight was unacceptable. Mr. Carter, I judged you unfairly, and I am truly sorry. The silence that followed was palpable. Anthony looked at Victoria, seeing for the first time not an antagonist, but a person struggling with her own prejudices and fears. I appreciate your words, Mrs. Reynolds. He replied calmly. Recognizing mistakes is the first step towards change. We all have prejudices to overcome. Olivia, who had stayed nearby, watched the scene with admiration. In her years as a flight attendant, she had never witnessed such a profound transformation in a group of strangers. As the conversation continued, now in a lighter and more hopeful tone, the pilot made an announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, we are approaching Los Angeles. Please return to your seats and fasten your seat belts for landing. The passengers began to disperse, but something had changed. Smiles were exchanged, hands were shaken, and a sense of unity hung in the air. Anthony leaned back in his seat, exhausted but with a sense of accomplishment. He looked out of the window, watching the lights of Los Angeles begin to shine on the horizon. This trip, which had begun in such a tumultuous way, was about to end in a way he could never have imagined. As the plane began its descent, Anthony reflected on how sometimes the greatest life lessons can come from the most unexpected situations, and how, even at heights, it is possible to find common ground and build bridges between differences. The plane touched the ground at Los Angeles International Airport with a slight bump, the wheels squeaking against the tarmac. Inside the cabin, a collective sigh of relief echoed among the passengers. For many, it was not only the end of a turbulent flight, but also the end of an unexpected emotional journey. Anthony Carter unbuckled his seatbelt, feeling a mixture of exhaustion and a strange sense of achievement. He looked around, noticing how the gazes of the other passengers had changed. Where once there had been suspicion and prejudice, he now saw respect and even admiration. Victoria Reynolds, sitting next to him, seemed lost in thought. Her face, once a mask of arrogance, now showed signs of deep internal reflection. She turned to Anthony, hesitantly. Mr. Carter. She began, her voice low and uncertain. I know that my previous words are not enough, but I would like to express again how sorry I am for my behavior. This trip, well, it taught me more than I could have imagined. Anthony nodded, offering a gentle smile. Sometimes, Mrs. Reynolds, life's most important lessons come when we least expect them. What's important is what we do with them. As the passengers prepared to disembark, Michael Donovan approached Anthony. Mr. Carter, I'd like to give you my card. My company is always looking for leaders with your experience and integrity. If you're interested in an opportunity, please get in touch. Anthony accepted the card, surprised and grateful. Thank you, Mr. Donovan. I'll give it serious consideration. Lauren Anderson, holding Ethan's hand, stopped next to Anthony. Mr. Carter, thank you for sharing your experiences with us. Not only did you keep us safe during the turmoil, but you also taught us a valuable lesson about empathy and courage. Ethan, looking at Anthony with eyes wide with admiration, added, When I grow up, I want to be brave like you. Anthony knelt down to be at the boy's eye level. Ethan, remember, true courage lies in treating everyone with respect and kindness, even when it's difficult. You're already on the right track. As the passengers began to get up and remove their luggage from the overhead compartments, Olivia, the flight attendant, approached Anthony. "Mr. Carter, on behalf of the entire crew, I'd like to thank you again for your help during the flight. Your presence made all the difference." She paused, looking around to make sure no one else was listening. "Also, I thought you should know, one of the passengers is a journalist for the Los Angeles Times. He was very interested in your story and the discussions that took place during the flight." Anthony felt a twinge of apprehension. He had never been one for the limelight. "Thanks for letting me know, Olivia. I hope that if anything is published, it will be to promote understanding and not further division." On disembarking, Anthony was surprised by a middle-aged man with a notepad. "Mr. Carter, I'm David Ramirez from the Los Angeles Times. I'd like to talk to you about your experience on this flight. I believe your story can inspire many people." Anthony hesitated for a moment, thinking about all the implications. Finally, he nodded. "All right, Mr. Ramirez, but on one condition, that the story isn't about me, but about how a group of strangers found common ground at a time of crisis." David smiled, agreeing. "It's exactly this kind of perspective that makes your story so valuable, Mr. Carter." As they walked towards the landing area, Anthony noticed Victoria watching him from afar. Their gazes met, and she gave a small nod of acknowledgement before turning and disappearing into the crowd. In the airport lounge, Anthony was approached by a few more passengers, all expressing gratitude and admiration. An elderly man shook his hand, saying with tears in his eyes, "My grandson serves in the army. Men like you give me hope for his future." As Anthony finally made his way to the airport exit, he reflected on the day's events. What had begun as a routine trip had turned into something much more significant. He realized that, even without meaning to, he had become a symbol of something bigger than himself. Outside, the California sun welcomed him with its welcoming warmth. Anthony took a deep breath, feeling the weight of expectations, but also a new sense of purpose. He didn't know exactly what the future held, but he was sure of one thing. This wasn't just the end of a journey, but the beginning of a new one. As he walked towards the cab, Anthony smiled to himself. Los Angeles, with all its promises and challenges, awaited him, and he was ready to face whatever lay ahead, with the same dignity and courage that had brought him here. The days that followed Anthony Carter's arrival in Los Angeles were a whirlwind of activity and emotion. The story of the flight, sensitively told by David Ramirez in the Los Angeles Times, quickly gained national traction. The article was entitled "Altitude of Understanding: How a Turbulent Flight Brought Strangers Together" went viral on social media, generating heated discussions about prejudice, empathy, and the possibility of change. Anthony, who was initially just looking for a peaceful new start, found himself at the center of a media storm he hadn't anticipated. Sitting in his modest rented apartment in Inglewood, he watched the city from his window, reflecting on the turn his life had taken. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Lauren Anderson. "Mr. Carter? This is Lauren from the flight. I hope I'm not disturbing you." Her voice sounded excited on the other end of the line. "Not at all, Lauren. How can I help you?" Anthony replied, genuinely happy to hear a familiar voice. "Well, it's just that Ethan won't stop talking about you. He even drew a picture at school about the hero of the plane, Chief. And, well, I was thinking, there's a careers fair at his school next week. Would it be too much to ask if you could come and talk to the children about your experience, about overcoming adversity?" Anthony hesitated for a moment. Public speaking had never been his strong suit, least of all for children. But the memory of Ethan's sparkling eyes made him reconsider. "You know what, Lauren? I'd love to," he replied, surprised by his own decision. On the morning of the careers fair, Anthony found himself in front of a room full of young, curious faces. Ethan, sitting in the front row, was grinning from ear to ear. "Good morning, children," Anthony began, his voice firm but gentle. "My name is Anthony Carter, and I'm here to talk about something very important: courage." He told stories adapted from his military experience, focusing on the importance of teamwork and mutual respect. He talked about facing fears and prejudices, both those of others and your own. Remember, he concluded, true courage lies not in never feeling afraid, but in doing the right thing even when you're scared. The children bombarded him with questions, their young minds eager for knowledge and inspiration. Anthony was surprised by the depth of some questions and the touching innocence of others. At the end of the presentation, the school principal, Mrs. Gabriela Martinez, approached Anthony with a warm smile. "Mr. Carter, your talk was inspiring. We have a mentoring program here at the school, focused on helping children from underprivileged communities. Would you like to consider joining us as a mentor?" Anthony felt a surge of emotion. The idea of being able to positively impact the lives of young people, especially those facing similar challenges to those he faced, was irresistible. "I'd be honored, Ms. Martinez," he replied, feeling that he had found a new purpose. Meanwhile, in a luxurious office in downtown Los Angeles, Victoria Reynolds stared at her computer screen. The email in her inbox was from the company's board of directors. "Dear Ms. Reynolds, in light of recent events and the negative repercussions on social media, the board of directors has decided that it would be in the best interest of the company's image for you to take a temporary leave of absence." Victoria felt the weight of her actions like never before. The shame and regret she had experienced on the plane were now mixed with the reality of the consequences of her behavior. With trembling hands, she opened a new tab in her browser and typed in, "How to Fight Internal Prejudices." It was a small step, but a start. Back at Anthony's apartment, the phone rang again. This time it was Michael Donovan. "Anthony, I hope you've considered my offer. We have a leadership position in our diversity and inclusion program that I believe would be perfect for you." Anthony smiled, remembering the card Michael had given him on the plane. "Actually, Mr. Donovan, I've been thinking about it a lot. But before I make any decisions, I'd like to know more about how your company is actively working to promote equality and combat prejudice in the workplace." The conversation that followed was long and productive, with Anthony asking incisive questions and offering insights based on his own experience. By the end, both he and Michael were enthusiastic about the possibilities. That night, lying in bed, Anthony reflected on the events of the last few weeks. What had begun as a turbulent flight had turned into a journey of transformation, not just for him, but for everyone involved. He picked up his phone and opened David Ramirez's article once more. The comments, mostly positive and hopeful, were a testament to the impact a single story could have. Anthony smiled to himself. The road ahead was still long, and there would undoubtedly be more turbulence. But now he knew he wasn't alone on this journey. With every person touched by his story, with every child inspired by his words, a small change was taking place. And sometimes, Anthony thought as he closed his eyes, it's those small changes that make all the difference. 3 months have passed since the fateful flight that changed Anthony Carter's life. The Californian fall painted the streets of Los Angeles in golden hues, reflecting the transformation that was taking place not only in nature, but also in the lives of Anthony and those around him. On a sunny Saturday morning, Anthony found himself in Griffith Park, taking part in a community event organized by the school where he now acted as a mentor. Children from different backgrounds were running and playing, their laughter echoing in the fresh morning air. "Mr. Carter! Mr. Carter!" Ethan's excited voice stood out from the crowd. The boy ran towards him, followed by Lauren, who was smiling broadly. "Hello, champ," Anthony greeted, ruffling the boy's hair affectionately. "How's the project on Community Heroes going?" Ethan was practically jumping with excitement. "Incredible. I chose to write about you, Mr. Carter. The teacher said my presentation was the best in the class." Lauren approached, her face beaming with pride. "Anthony, I can't thank you enough for the impact you've had on Ethan's life. He's been talking about enlisting when he's older, to help people like Mr. Carter does, Anthony felt a wave of emotion run through him. "Ethan, remember, There are many ways to serve and make a difference. The important thing is to always treat others with respect and kindness. As they talked, Anthony noticed a familiar figure approaching hesitantly. It was Victoria Reynolds, looking very different from the arrogant woman he had met on the plane. Her face was marked by a mixture of nervousness and determination. "Mr. Carter?" Victoria called out softly. "Can I speak to you for a moment?" Anthony nodded, asking Lauren and Ethan to excuse him. He and Victoria moved a little away, finding a nearby bench to sit on. I wasn't sure if I should come," Victoria began, her voice trembling slightly. "But after everything that's happened, I felt I needed to talk to you in person." Anthony remained silent, giving her space to continue. "I lost my job," she admitted. "At first I was furious. I blamed everyone but myself. But then I started to really reflect on my actions, on the prejudices I carried without even realizing it." Victoria paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "For the last few weeks, I've been doing volunteer work at a community center in the city center. It's an experience that's opening my eyes in ways I never imagined possible." Anthony observed the genuine change in Victoria. Her eyes, once cold and judgmental, now shone with new understanding. "Victoria," he said gently, "the fact that you are here, admitting your mistakes and seeking change, already shows enormous growth. It's not easy to face your own prejudices." Victoria nodded, tears forming in her eyes. "I wanted to ask for your help. The community center is organizing a mentoring program for young people from underprivileged areas. I thought maybe you could give us some guidance on how to approach issues of diversity and inclusion." Anthony smiled, feeling a mixture of surprise and admiration at Victoria's transformation. "I'd be delighted to help, Victoria. In fact, I have a few ideas I'd like to share." As they talked, drawing up plans for the mentoring program, Anthony noticed Michael Donovan approaching, accompanied by a woman he recognized as the CEO of an important civil rights organization. "Anthony!" Michael called out, waving. "We have some exciting news to share about the company's diversity initiative." As the day progressed, the park became a microcosm of change and hope. Children from different backgrounds played together. Adults engaged in meaningful conversations about inclusion and mutual understanding, and new partnerships were formed to promote equality. In the late afternoon, as the sun began to set, Anthony found himself surrounded by a diverse group of people: Lauren and Ethan, Victoria, Michael, community leaders, and many others who had been touched by his story. "You know," he said, looking at the group, "when I got on that flight a few months ago, I never imagined I'd be here today. But looking at all of you, at everything we've accomplished together, I realize that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest gestures." A murmur of agreement ran through the group. Victoria, with tears in her eyes, spoke. "You taught us that it's never too late to change, to be better." Ethan, tugging on Anthony's sleeve, asked with shining eyes, "Mr. Carter, do you think that one day there will be no more prejudice in the world?" Anthony knelt down to the boy's level, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Ethan, this is a dream worth fighting for. And with young people like you leading the way, I believe we're closer to that day than ever before." As the group dispersed, each carrying with them a spark of hope and determination, Anthony looked out over the Los Angeles skyline. The city, with all its complexities and contradictions, looked different now, not a place of division, but a fertile ground for change and growth. He knew that the road ahead would still be challenging. Deep-rooted prejudices don't disappear overnight. But looking at the people around him, at the connections forged and the minds opened, Anthony felt a surge of optimism. The journey that had begun on a turbulent flight had turned into something much bigger. And as the sun set over Los Angeles, Anthony Carter knew that this was just the first page of a new chapter, not just in his life, but in the lives of all those his story had touched. Winter arrived in Los Angeles, bringing with it a subtle change in the city's landscape and unexpected challenges for Anthony Carter. 6 months had passed since the flight that changed his life, and the waves of change he had initiated continued to spread, but not always in the way he had hoped. On a cold January morning, Anthony arrived at the office of Michael Donovan's technology company, where he now worked as director of the Diversity and Inclusion Program. As he entered the meeting room, he immediately felt the tension in the air. Michael welcomed him with a tense smile. "Anthony, we have a problem." Anthony sat down, mentally preparing himself. "What happened?" Michael slid a folder across the table. "We've received a lawsuit. A group of employees are claiming reverse discrimination, saying that our new hiring policies unfairly disadvantage them." Anthony felt a weight in his stomach. He knew that implementing diversity policies wouldn't always be easy, but he hadn't expected such a strong reaction. "Who is leading this group?" Anthony asked, leafing through the documents. "Robert Caldwell, from the IT department." Michael replied, "He's been vocal about his opposition to our initiatives from the start." Anthony nodded, remembering the heated discussions he'd had with Robert over the last few weeks. "I see. What does the legal team suggest?" "They recommend that we back off a bit, that we soften some of the policies to avoid further conflict." Michael said, clearly uncomfortable with the idea. Anthony was silent for a moment, pondering. Finally, he looked at Michael with determination. "No, we can't back down. That would send out the wrong message. We need to face this head on." Michael seemed relieved by Anthony's response. "I was hoping you'd say that. What do you suggest?" "Let's set up a meeting with Robert and his group. Listen to their concerns. Explain our point of view. Maybe we can find common ground." Anthony proposed. That afternoon, Anthony found himself facing a group of hostile employees led by Robert Caldwell, a middle-aged man with a defiant look on his face. "Mr. Carter," Robert began, his voice laced with sarcasm. "Can you explain to us how it's fair to undermine qualified employees in the name of diversity?" Anthony took a deep breath, remembering all the times he had faced prejudice in his life. "Mr. Caldwell, our policies are not designed to disadvantage anyone. They exist to ensure that everyone has equal opportunities, regardless of their background." The discussion that followed was intense. Anthony listened attentively to the group's concerns, responding with patience and empathy, but also standing firm on his principles. "Understand," he said at a crucial moment, "diversity is not about taking opportunities away from you. It's about creating an environment where everyone can thrive. That benefits all of us, including you." By the end of the meeting, although not everyone was convinced, there was a different atmosphere in the room. Robert, in particular, looked thoughtful. "Mr. Carter," he said as everyone left, "I still don't completely agree with you, but thank you for listening. Perhaps we could continue this conversation." Anthony nodded, feeling a small victory. "Of course, Robert. My door is always open." Later that day, Anthony received an unexpected phone call. It was Victoria Reynolds. "Anthony," she said, her voice trembling, "I need your help. The community center where I've been working, they found out about my past, about the incident on the plane. Some members of the board want me removed." Anthony felt a twinge of sympathy. "Victoria, you've changed a lot since then. We can't let past mistakes define who we are now." He promised to help, thinking about how he could use his influence to support Victoria on her journey of redemption. That evening, in his apartment, Anthony reflected on the day's events. The challenges he faced now were different from those he had encountered on the battlefield, or even on the turbulent flight, but no less important. He picked up his phone and called Lauren Anderson. "Lauren, it's Anthony. I was wondering, that mentoring program at Ethan's school. I think I have some ideas about how we can expand it." As he discussed his plans with Lauren, Anthony felt a renewed sense of purpose. The obstacles he faced were just opportunities in disguise to bring about even greater change. Outside, The rain began to fall gently on Los Angeles, washing the city clean and promising a new beginning. Anthony knew that the road ahead would be challenging, but he was ready to face it, one step at a time, one mind at a time. As the evening progressed, he began to sketch out plans for the coming months, training programs, community initiatives, partnerships with other companies. Each idea was a seed of change, waiting to blossom. Anthony smiled to himself. Today's challenges were just the start of a bigger journey, a journey that, he hoped, would lead not only him, but the entire community to a more inclusive and understanding future. Spring arrived in Los Angeles, bringing with it not only the blooming of flowers, but also a series of unexpected events that tested Anthony Carter's resolve. On a sunny April morning, he was in his office at Michael Donovan's company, reviewing the progress of the last few weeks, when his phone rang. Mr. Carter. The voice on the other end was hesitant, almost unrecognizable. "This is Robert Caldwell." Anthony straightened up in his chair, surprised. Since the tense meeting months ago, Robert had become less hostile, but still kept a cautious distance. "Robert, how can I help?" Anthony replied, maintaining a neutral tone. I need to talk to you. It's about my daughter, Sophia. Robert's voice faltered. "She's being bullied at school because of the color of her skin." Anthony's heart squeezed. "I'm sorry to hear that, Robert. Would you like to meet up and talk in person?" Hours later, Anthony found himself in a cafe near the office, sitting opposite a visibly shaken Robert Caldwell. "I never thought I'd be on the other side of this situation," Robert admitted, his eyes red from crying. "Sophia is adopted, you know. She's black, and I never really understood what she could face." Anthony listened patiently as Robert vented, telling him about the insults Sophia heard at school, about how she came home crying, asking why she was different. "Robert," Anthony said softly when the other man had finished, "what Sophia is going through is exactly why we fight for diversity and inclusion. It's not about taking opportunities away from anyone. It's about creating a world where children like Sophia can grow up without fear, without being ashamed of who they are." Robert nodded, tears in his eyes. "I understand now, Anthony. I really do. How can I help?" At that moment, an idea began to form in Anthony's mind. "How about we start with your own team? We could develop a mentoring program, connecting employees from different backgrounds." As they discussed the details, Anthony felt a surge of hope. Change was happening, one person at a time. A few days later, Anthony received another unexpected call. It was David Ramirez, the journalist who had written the article about the incident on the plane. "Anthony, I have some news you need to know," David said, his voice serious. "I'm working on a follow-up story about the impact of your story. During my research, I discovered something about Victoria Reynolds." Anthony felt a chill run down his spine. "What did you find out, David?" Apparently, before the incident on the plane, Victoria had a history of discriminatory behavior in her former company. There are reports of ex-employees being fired or disadvantaged because of their race or origin. The news hit Anthony like a punch in the gut. He thought of Victoria, of her apparent transformation, of the work she had been doing at the community center. "David, what do you intend to do with this information?" Anthony asked, his mind racing. "I intend to publish it, Anthony. People have a right to know." Anthony closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the decision he had to make. "I understand, David. But before I publish, can I ask you to give me a few days? There's something I need to do first." After hanging up, Anthony immediately called Victoria. "We need to talk," he said simply. Hours later, they met in a quiet park. Anthony watched Victoria approach, noticing the change in her countenance since the day of the flight. She seemed more humble, more aware. "Victoria." Anthony began, choosing his words carefully. "I've received some information about your past, before the incident on the plane." He saw her face turn pale, but continued. "I know you've been working hard to change, to make a difference, but if we really want to bring about change, we need to be honest about our past." Victoria nodded slowly, tears forming in her eyes. "You're right, Anthony. I'm ashamed of what I did, of who I was, but I can't hide it forever." Together, they came up with a plan. Victoria agreed to make a public statement, admitting her past mistakes and detailing the changes she had made in her life. Anthony promised to support her, emphasizing the importance of forgiveness and second chances. In the weeks that followed, Victoria's story became public. There were mixed reactions. Some applauded her honesty and efforts to change. Others condemned her for her past. The community center where she worked decided to keep her on, recognizing her commitment to change. In the midst of all this, Anthony continued her work at the company, expanding the diversity and inclusion program. The mentoring project with Robert Caldwell was taking off, creating bridges between employees from different backgrounds. One afternoon, as Anthony was walking down the company corridor, he heard laughter coming from the conference room. Peeking through the ajar door, he saw Robert Caldwell chatting animatedly with a diverse group of colleagues, including some who had previously shunned him. At that moment, Anthony felt a deep sense of accomplishment. The challenges would continue, he knew, but every small victory, every open mind, was a step in the right direction. As he headed to his office, Anthony received a message from Lauren Anderson. "Ethan wants you to know that he made a new friend at school today. His name is Jamal, and Ethan says he's just as cool as you, Mr. Carter." Anthony smiled, feeling a surge of emotion. Change was happening, one child at a time, one conversation at a time. And he was determined to keep fighting, no matter how difficult the path might be. The sweltering Los Angeles summer brought with it a wave of change that Anthony Carter could never have predicted. As the city simmered under the relentless sun, the seeds of transformation he had planted over the months began to blossom in surprising ways. On a particularly hot July morning, Anthony found himself in the auditorium of Michael Donovan's company, observing a scene that, months ago, would have seemed impossible. Robert Caldwell, once his biggest opponent, Chan, was on stage, conducting a workshop on inclusion in the workplace. "It's not just about policies and numbers," Robert said, his voice charged with emotion. "It's about creating an environment where everyone, regardless of their background, can thrive. Where my daughter Sophia can grow up without fear of being who she is." Anthony felt a surge of pride at seeing Robert's transformation. The man who once led a lawsuit against the company's diversity policies was now one of its biggest defenders. After the workshop, Anthony was approached by Victoria Reynolds, who was now working as a diversity consultant for several companies in the region. "Anthony," she began, a mixture of excitement and nervousness in her voice. "I've received an invitation to speak at a national conference on personal and corporate transformation. They want me to share my journey, our journey." Anthony smiled, recognizing the weight of this moment. "Victoria, this is incredible. Your story can inspire so many people to change." "Yes, but—" Victoria hesitated. "They also want you to speak about how your compassion and leadership have been fundamental in this process of change." The news took Anthony by surprise. He had always preferred to work behind the scenes, letting others take the spotlight. But before he could respond, his phone rang. It was Lauren Anderson. "Anthony, you need to come to Ethan's school immediately." Lauren's voice was tense. "There's been a racial incident. Ethan is involved." Anthony's heart raced. He quickly apologized to Victoria and ran to his car. All the way to school, his mind was buzzing with worries. What could have happened? Ethan, who had always been a champion of equality, involved in a racial incident. Upon arriving at the school, Anthony found Lauren in the principal's office, along with Ethan and another boy, both with downcast expressions. The principal, Dr. Martinez, explained the situation. "There was a fight in the playground. Apparently, some older boys were making racist comments about Jamal, Ethan's friend. Ethan intervened and, well, things escalated. Anthony looked at Ethan, noticing a bruise forming over his left eye. "Ethan, what exactly happened?" Ethan looked up, his eyes filled with restrained tears. "They were being mean to Jamal, Mr. Carter, saying horrible things. I remembered what you always say about standing up for what's right. I couldn't stand by." Anthony felt a mixture of pride and concern. He knelt down to Ethan's level. "You did the right thing by standing up for your friend, Ethan, but violence is never the answer. There are other ways to fight injustice." Dr. Martinez intervened. "Mr. Carter, given your work on diversity and inclusion, I'd like to propose something. Instead of punishment, how about Ethan and the other boys involved take part in an educational program about respect and diversity?" Anthony nodded, an idea forming in his mind. "Actually, Dr. Martinez, I'd like to offer to lead that program. We could expand it to the whole school, not just those involved in the incident." In the weeks that followed, Anthony found himself immersed in a new challenge. In addition to his work at the company and his preparations for the national conference, he was now spending hours at Ethan's school, developing and implementing a diversity awareness program for children. One day, while conducting a session with a group of students, Anthony noticed a familiar figure watching from the classroom doorway. It was David Ramirez, the journalist who had covered his story from the beginning. After the session, David approached him. "Anthony, I came to give you an update on your story, but I see I've found something much bigger. The impact you're having is extraordinary." Anthony smiled, tired but satisfied. "David, this is bigger than me. It's about creating a future where children like Ethan and Jamal can grow up in a fairer, more understanding world." As they walked down the school corridor, Anthony reflected on the journey that had brought him there. From the turbulent flight to the corporate corridors, and now to the classroom, every step had been a lesson in perseverance, compassion, and the transformative power of education. "You know, David," Anthony said, pausing to look at a colorful mural made by the students, depicting people of all colors and backgrounds holding hands. "When I started this journey, I thought I was fighting prejudice. But now I see that we are building something much bigger. We are cultivating hope." David nodded, furiously taking notes. "And what's the next step in this journey, Anthony?" Anthony looked out of the window, seeing Ethan and Jamal playing in the playground, laughing and running around without worrying about their differences. A smile formed on his lips. "The next step, keep planting seeds, David, in every mind, in every heart. Because that's how we change the world, one person at a time, one conversation at a time." As the Los Angeles sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the school, Anthony felt a renewed sense of purpose. The challenges were still many, but looking at the children in the playground, the mural on the wall, the transformation he saw in people like Robert and Victoria, he knew they were on the right track. The journey was far from over, but each step took them closer to a brighter, more inclusive future. And Anthony was determined to continue leading the way, inspiring others to join him on this vital mission. Fall arrived in Los Angeles, bringing with it a cool breeze and a sense of anticipation. It was the day of the National Conference on Diversity and Inclusion, and Anthony Carter found himself backstage in the large auditorium, his heart pounding with a mixture of nervousness and determination. Next to him, Victoria Reynolds was nervously adjusting her blazer. "Anthony," she whispered, "what if they don't believe in my change? What if they think it's all a hoax?" Anthony put a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Victoria, your journey is real. Your transformation is genuine. Share your truth, and people will see." Across the stage, Anthony saw familiar faces in the audience. Michael Donovan was there, along with Robert Caldwell and his daughter Sophia. Lauren Anderson and Ethan waved encouragingly from their seats. Even David Ramirez was there, pen and notepad in hand, ready to document this crucial moment. The host took the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our next speakers, two individuals whose lives intersected on a turbulent flight and who, ever since there, have worked tirelessly to promote understanding and inclusion. Please welcome Anthony Carter and Victoria Reynolds. To loud applause, Anthony and Victoria took to the stage. Anthony began, his voice firm and clear. A year ago, I was just a veteran trying to restart my life. Victoria was a successful executive with deep-rooted prejudices. Our meeting could have been just another sad example of intolerance, but instead, it became the catalyst for a change that neither of us could have foreseen. Victoria then took the floor, her voice shaky at first, but gaining strength. I was the villain in this story. My ignorance and prejudice almost destroyed the life of an honorable man. But thanks to Anthony's compassion and my own will to change, I am here today not as an antagonist, but as an ally in the fight against prejudice. Together, they shared their experiences of the last few months, the challenges faced in Michael's company, the mentoring program started by Robert, the work in schools with Ethan and his colleagues. What we've learned, Anthony continued, is that real change doesn't happen overnight. It's an ongoing process of education, self-reflection, and action. Every difficult conversation, every open mind, is a step towards a more inclusive future. Victoria nodded, adding, and it's a journey that requires courage. Courage to admit our mistakes, courage to forgive, and courage to keep fighting even when the path seems impossible. As they spoke, Anthony noticed something extraordinary happening in the audience. People of different backgrounds, races, and ages were turning to each other, starting conversations, exchanging smiles and handshakes. The energy in the auditorium was palpable, a mixture of hope, determination, and unity. At the end of his presentation, the audience rose to their feet in a thunderous ovation. Anthony saw tears in the eyes of many, including Victoria next to him. After the conference, while greeting the participants, Anthony was approached by an elderly woman. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice laced with emotion. "I was on that flight with you. I was silent when I should have spoken. Your courage inspired me to do better. Thank you." One after another, people came up to share how Anthony and Victoria's story had touched them and motivated them to make changes in their own lives and communities. David Ramirez approached, a broad smile on his face. "Anthony, Victoria, you've just given me the perfect headline for my next story. From Adversaries to Allies, How a Turbulent Meeting Inspired a National Movement." Later that evening, Anthony found himself at a celebratory dinner with his closest friends and allies. Michael proposed a toast. To Anthony Carter, a man who turned adversity into opportunity and taught us the true meaning of leadership and compassion. Ethan, sitting next to Anthony, tugged on his sleeve. "Mr. Carter, when I grow up, I want to be just like you." Anthony smiled, ruffling the boy's hair affectionately. "Ethan, you're already better than me. You and your generation are the future we're building." As the night wore on, Anthony found himself reflecting on the incredible journey he had been on. From the tense moment on that plane to this celebratory dinner, every step had been a lesson in perseverance, compassion, and the transformative power of mutual understanding. Looking around the table at the smiling faces of his friends, Victoria, now a passionate advocate for inclusion, Robert, an unlikely but dedicated ally, Lauren and Ethan, symbols of hope for the future, Anthony felt a wave of emotion wash over him. "Friends," he said, rising to make his own toast, "what we've achieved so far is just the beginning. We have a long way to go, but looking at all of you, I know that we are not alone on this journey. Together we can build a world where diversity is celebrated, where inclusion is the norm, and where every individual is valued for who they are." As the glasses clinked and the voices rose in agreement, Anthony looked out of the window at the Los Angeles skyline. The lights of the city shone like stars, each one representing a life, a story, an opportunity for change. He knew the challenges would continue. Prejudice and intolerance would not disappear overnight. But with each open mind, each touched heart, they were building a better future, one step at a time. And as the night deepened and the conversations flowed around them, Anthony Carter felt a deep peace. The journey that had begun on that turbulent flight had taken him to a destination he could never have imagined. Not just a new beginning for himself, but the chance to help shape a new beginning for an entire society. The future, with all its promises and challenges, awaited. And Anthony was ready to face it, no longer alone, but alongside a community united by a common dream of a fairer, more compassionate world for all. If you could change one attitude or belief you've had in the past about someone different from you, what would it be? And how could that change positively impact your community today? Thanks for watching. Comment below what you thought of this story, and from which city you are watching us. Leave your like and subscribe to our channel so that together we can build a huge community that shares inspiring stories. Until next time.